In the year 874, a small fleet of Norse ships pushed west into open ocean, heading toward a land they had only heard about in stories. Iceland was still empty of permanent settlers. The sailors on board had no fresh food, no way to fish reliably in a storm, and no port to restock for weeks at a time. What kept many of them alive was not grain or dried fish, it was barrels of salted butter, packed tight enough to survive months at sea without spoiling. An entire voyage that helped populate a new country depended, in part, on a dairy product most people today spread on toast without a second thought. That fact alone says something strange about butter. Something this ordinary was once a matter of life and death, a piece of cargo that carried the same weight as fresh water or dried meat. To understand how that happened, the story has to go back much further than the Viking Age, back to the very first time a human being turned milk into fat on purpose. Nobody knows the exact moment butter was invented, because it likely was not invented at all in the usual sense. It was probably discovered by accident, the way many early food technologies were. Historians and archaeologists generally agree that the practice began somewhere among nomadic herding peoples in Central Asia or parts of Africa, roughly 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. This is an estimate, not a precise figure, since the earliest evidence comes from residue on pottery and animal skin containers rather than written records. These early herders carried milk in bags made from animal stomachs or hides as they moved with their livestock across long distances. The constant motion of walking, riding, or traveling by cart for hours caused the milk inside those bags to churn without anyone intending it. Fat molecules in the milk clumped together under that repeated agitation, separating out from the thinner liquid around them into a solid mass. That solid mass was butter, formed not by careful invention but by the rhythm of daily travel and the physical jostling of a journey. Once people noticed what was happening inside those bags, they began to recreate the process on purpose, shaking milk deliberately instead of waiting for a journey to do the work for them. This makes butter one of the oldest processed foods that humans still consume in a form not far removed from its original method of production. It is worth pausing on how significant that is. Very few foods eaten today were also being made in roughly the same way before the invention of writing itself. Butter belongs to that small category, alongside things like bread, cheese, and fermented drinks, foods so old that they predate almost every civilization that later grew up around them. Some of the earliest confirmed evidence of deliberate butter production comes from the region of ancient Sumer in what is now southern Iraq. Archaeologists have found stone carvings and clay tablets dating back roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years that show people churning milk in tall, narrow vessels. One famous carved frieze known to historians as the Ubaid butter churning scene depicts what appears to be a step-by-step dairy process that closely resembles butter making, complete with figures working together around a container. Cuneiform tablets from the same region also mention dairy fat in administrative and religious records, suggesting it held real economic value. In this hot Mesopotamian climate, however, butter did not stay solid or fresh for long once it was made. It was prized, but it was often used more for religious offerings, medicinal remedies, and skin treatments than for everyday eating the way bread or barley was consumed. Priests and healers in this region are recorded as using dairy fats in preparations meant to soothe skin conditions and wounds, treating butter as something closer to medicine than to a simple food item. Ancient Egypt also had a relationship with dairy fat, though the evidence there is less complete and less certain than in Mesopotamia. Some tomb paintings and surviving texts suggest early dairy processing took place, including churning of some kind. Egypt's intense heat, however, made solid butter extremely difficult to store or transport reliably. Because of this, butter's role in the ordinary Egyptian diet remained limited compared to the role played by oils pressed from plants, which held up far better in a hot, dry climate. A far stronger and more enduring butter tradition developed in ancient India, one that in many ways has never really stopped. In Vedic religious texts dating back roughly 3,000 years, clarified butter appears again and again as a sacred and symbolically important substance. This clarified butter is known as ghee, made by slowly heating butter until the milk solids separate out and can be strained away, leaving a pure golden fat behind. Ghee could survive the Indian heat far better than raw butter, since removing the milk solids also removed much of what caused spoilage in a warm climate. Ghee was poured into ritual fires as an offering to the gods, a practice described repeatedly in early Vedic hymns and later religious commentary. It was used in cooking, in traditional Ayurvedic medicine, and in everyday household rituals that connected food directly to spiritual life. Ghee production also became an important part of rural economies in India, with entire communities built around cattle herding and dairy processing for this single purified fat. This is one of the oldest continuously practiced dairy traditions anywhere in the world, stretching from ancient scripture to modern Indian kitchens without a real break in the chain of practice. While ghee flourished in the heat of South Asia, ordinary, unclarified butter found its true home in a much cooler part of the world. Northern and Western Europe, particularly the region that is now Ireland, Scotland, and Scandinavia, had the cold, damp climate that butter needed to stay solid and genuinely usable for extended periods. In these regions, butter became a real dietary staple rather than an occasional luxury reserved for the wealthy or for religious ceremonies. People here developed a striking preservation method that still puzzles and fascinates archaeologists today. They buried large wooden containers of butter deep in peat bogs, sometimes several feet below the surface. The cold temperature, the low oxygen levels, and the highly acidic environment of a bog work together to slow spoilage dramatically, in some cases preserving the fat for what appears to be centuries. This buried product is known today as bog butter, and archaeologists in Ireland alone have recovered hundreds of these containers, some estimated to be well over 1,000 years old. Historians are not entirely certain why people buried it in the first place. Some evidence points toward long-term food storage during lean seasons, some points toward using bog butter as a form of currency or tribute paid to local lords, and some suggests a possible ritual or symbolic purpose tied to the land itself. Because the historical record on this practice is incomplete, all of these explanations should be treated as reasonable, evidence-supported theories rather than settled fact. This is also the world that the Vikings came from, the same world referenced at the very start of this story. For Norse communities living in Scandinavia, salted butter packed tightly into wooden barrels was dense in calories, resistant to spoilage, and relatively easy to transport on long, dangerous sea voyages. It became part of the standard provisions that helped Norse sailors travel enormous distances, from Scandinavia to the British Isles to Iceland, and eventually toward the harsher coasts of Greenland. Salted, preserved dairy fat offered something that fresh meat or fish could not, a stable source of energy that did not need to be caught, hunted, or replenished along the way. Butter in this period was not just food to be eaten around a fire, it was traded between communities, sometimes used to pay rents or debts, and in some regions treated almost like a form of currency, since it held real, storable, transportable value in a world without reliable refrigeration or banking. As Europe moved into the medieval period, butter took on a surprising social and religious dimension that shaped daily life for centuries. In southern Europe, where olive trees grew easily in the warm Mediterranean climate, olive oil remained the dominant cooking fat, and butter was sometimes looked down on as a food associated with poorer, colder, less refined northern regions. In the north, however, butter was simply how people lived and cooked, since olive trees could not survive that climate at all, and alternatives were limited. The Catholic Church added another twist to butter's story during this era, one that connected an everyday food directly to religious law. During Lent, church rules traditionally restricted the eating of animal fats, including butter, for a period of about 40 days leading up to Easter. For people in northern regions who relied on butter constantly for cooking, baking, and preserving food, this restriction was a serious hardship, not a minor inconvenience. Wealthy individuals, families, and even entire communities could sometimes pay the church for a special dispensation, a kind of formal permission, allowing them to continue eating butter during Lent in exchange for a donation. One of the most famous examples of this tradition is tied to Rouen Cathedral in France, where a tower is traditionally said to have been funded, at least in part, by donations collected from wealthy parishioners in exchange for these butter dispensations. This story has been told and retold for centuries as a piece of local and religious history. While the general church practice of selling Lenten exemptions is well documented across medieval Europe, some of the specific details around this particular tower's funding are debated by historians, so it should be treated as a popular tradition with a real historical basis rather than an exact, fully verified account. By the time Europe reached the early modern period, butter had become deeply embedded in daily life, farming economies, and regional identity across much of the continent. It was churned by hand in homes and on small farms, often as part of the routine daily or weekly work carried out by women within a household. Recipes, folk sayings, and local customs grew up around butter making in country after country, from Ireland to the Netherlands to the German states. This system of small-scale, local butter production continued largely unchanged in its basic method for centuries, even as the societies around it transformed dramatically through wars, plagues, and political change. Butter making during this period was often one of the few sources of independent income available to rural women, since surplus butter could be sold or traded at local markets even when a family had little other cash to rely on. In several regions, local guilds and markets developed strict rules about butter quality, weight, and packaging, an early sign of the kind of food regulation that would later define the industry on a much larger scale. That long, slow history of tradition is where the story takes its sharpest and most unexpected turn. In the 1860s, France was dealing with a shortage of affordable fat for its growing urban population and for feeding its military during a period of instability. Emperor Napoleon III offered a prize to anyone who could develop a cheaper substitute for butter, something that could feed soldiers, sailors, and working-class families without the expense of traditional dairy farming. In 1869, a French chemist named Hippolyte Mege answered that challenge and claimed the prize. He developed a new spread made primarily from beef tallow blended with skim milk, and he gave it the name Margarine, based on a term describing one of the fatty acids involved in the process. It was cheaper to produce than butter, it could be manufactured at a much larger industrial scale, and it did not depend on the same seasonal, weather-dependent dairy farming that butter always had. This invention set off decades of conflict that many people today have never heard about, and it is one of the strangest chapters in the entire story of food. As margarine spread across Europe and then into the United States in the final decades of the 1800s, dairy farmers and butter producers saw it as a direct and serious threat to their livelihoods. Rather than competing purely on price, taste, or quality, the established butter industry turned to lawmakers for protection. In the United States, dairy interests lobbied aggressively and successfully for laws that placed heavy special taxes on margarine, well above ordinary food taxes. Some states went even further, passing laws that required margarine to be dyed pink, a color deliberately chosen to make it look unnatural and unappetizing next to pale, natural butter. Other regulations banned margarine producers from adding any yellow coloring to their product at all, forcing consumers to purchase plain white margarine and mix in a small packet of yellow dye themselves at home if they wanted it to resemble butter on the table. These laws were not really about protecting public health or food safety in any meaningful sense. They were largely about protecting an established, politically connected industry from a cheaper new competitor. These restrictions remained in place in various forms for decades, and some of the last remaining margarine coloring laws in the United States were not fully repealed until the 1960s and 1970s. It is a strange, mostly forgotten chapter in food history where a simple, spreadable fat became the center of genuine legislative battles, court cases, and industry lobbying campaigns that stretched across a full century. Through the 20th century, butter production itself was transformed by rapid industrialization, moving far away from the hand-churned farmhouse process that had defined it for thousands of years. Mechanical cream separators, refrigerated rail cars and trucks, and large-scale commercial creameries replaced much of the manual labor that once went into every batch. Butter became a standardized, mass-produced, widely available grocery item sold in uniform blocks with predictable quality rather than a farmhouse product made in small, inconsistent batches that varied from one household to the next. Mid-century also brought a major and lasting shift in how people viewed butter's place in a healthy diet. Starting in the 1950s and continuing for decades afterward, growing concern about saturated fat and heart disease led many doctors and health authorities to recommend margarine over butter as the supposedly heart-healthy choice. Millions of households switched their spread of choice based on this widely repeated medical advice. Later research complicated that picture considerably in ways that surprised many nutrition experts at the time. Many margarines produced during this era relied on partially hydrogenated vegetable oils to stay solid and spreadable at room temperature, and those oils were later found to contain trans fats. Ongoing research eventually linked trans fats to serious cardiovascular health risks, in some studies appearing worse than the saturated fat they had originally been designed to replace. This is a well-documented shift in nutritional science, not a fringe theory, and it led major health guidelines to be revised again in the following decades. Much of the original harsh warning against butter was later softened considerably, as trans fat concerns became the greater public health priority among researchers and regulators. None of this is presented to argue that one fat is definitively better than the other in every context, since dietary science continues to evolve and individual health needs vary from person to person. What is clear and well supported by the historical record is that butter survived thousands of years of changing technology, changing religious rules, changing politics, and changing nutritional advice, and it is still sitting in kitchens around the world today, essentially unchanged in its basic form. That brings the story to the present. Right now, in refrigerators and pantries everywhere, butter sits in a simple wrapped block, taken almost entirely for granted by the people who use it every day. It is used to fry eggs, to finish a pan sauce, to make pastry flaky and layered, and to give baked bread its rich flavor and soft, tender texture. Modern bakeries and home kitchens depend on the exact same basic chemistry that nomadic herders stumbled onto thousands of years ago. Fat separated out of milk through simple physical agitation. Artisanal and cultured butters made using fermentation techniques with roots stretching back centuries into European farmhouse tradition have also seen a genuine resurgence in recent years as small producers focus on flavor, texture, and traditional methods rather than mass production alone. Some of these modern producers even market their butter using the same basic language of tradition and craft that would have been familiar to a medieval European farmer, even though the equipment involved has changed almost completely. The next time butter melts into a warm piece of toast or slowly browns in a hot pan, it is worth remembering that this same basic substance once helped Viking sailors survive open ocean voyages, funded parts of a French cathedral through Lenten dispensations, and became the subject of real, decades-long political battles in state legislatures. An object this ordinary rarely gets credit for a history this dramatic, this global, and this strange. If this video helped you see something as simple as butter in a completely different way, subscribe for more hidden histories of the food sitting in your kitchen right now. Leave a comment and share what part of this story surprised you the most, or let this channel know what everyday food or drink you want covered next.